All right, well, welcome back. I'm Paul Vaaler from the University of Minnesota, one of the co-hosts of the conference. And again, I want to compliment our local hosts here at George Washington University for what has been a really rich discussion of academic and now policy perspectives with the last panel earlier this morning. We're going to continue this, what I hope will be a lively discussion, brief presentation discussion with some of our research colleagues that are here to talk about a topic that can spin off in different directions. But I think that there's nothing wrong with talking about broad topics like this and to find where the similarities are. We're talking about where we've been and where we're going with this research on international business and innovation. And as we present in brief down this row and then take your questions and I hope have a lively discussion, we keep in mind some themes that have been running throughout the conference, starting with yesterday, starting with our keynote from John Cantwell about issues about innovation, that broad sense as problem solving and not merely the technologies that we have in our hands or on our wrists or the big technologies that we see here that are so heavy in capital investment, but simple things, simple innovations involving small groups or individuals, innovations around finance, innovations around basic information transfer. Also to think and keep in mind about the notion of dispersion, of the idea that innovators, at least in an international business sense, begin and perhaps maybe they end with the multinational corporation. But they're not all the only players that are with it. They contribute to a dispersion of the innovation network, of the activities that are so important to developing new products, processes, and new rules of the game for those things. And then perhaps also to think about improbable pairings. I thought this morning's panel from our practitioners, policymakers in the field was really helpful for us to think about how multinationals and other private sector firms interact increasingly with public sector agencies and that increasingly large and capable non-governmental organization sector, civil society sector that's so important to the creation of products and processes, particularly in the developing world. And to think about how our research that often touches on what firms do or what inventors do and innovators do is the product as well as a contributor to those sometimes improbable partnerships. And so we keep those things in mind and we talk about our own research because at the end of the day, that's what we like to do, the idea. Think about also whether the similarities, what you hear in the panel in their initial presentations, and then as we move into our discussion, thinking about these themes, thinking about these similarities, thinking about where we're going next. So with that, let me turn it over to Martine for some comments.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I guess I'm going to take us in a really different direction from where we've been, just because the kinds of research that I do are really kind of, thinking about where we've been, where we're going. I think about much more about what's going on inside firms and inside multinationals than most of the research that we've been hearing about so far. So, just to put it in context, lots of research on innovation. I mean, we've been hearing a lot yesterday as well as today, policy level, big, between countries level, which is really, there's obviously a lot of hot stuff happening in terms of innovation policy and how, industries should be thinking about innovation at a really macro level, which is fascinating to hear about and learn about. Long history of research on how firms innovate and even on within firms, business units within firms and how business units relate to each other within firms, which, we're all very familiar with, and a lot of the research that we've been hearing touches on these kinds of issues at different levels. What I think about a lot is how work happens inside firms, and as I think more about innovation, which I am starting to think about much more in my research, how innovation happens inside firms. So to some extent, this is sort of a process perspective, but I try to connect it very strongly to performance. So what is it that allows some teams or individuals within large multinational distributed firms to be very successful or to innovate successfully in particular, and what are the barriers that might stand in their way? So how does this stuff actually happen kind of on the ground? So a lot of my research is about collaboration in some form, and so how does knowledge sharing happen inside firms, because we obviously know the knowledge-based perspective on these things has been very influential in terms of both how do people share what they know through networks and through their personal connections, and how is technology facilitating that, right? So quite a bit of my research looks at the use of databases or electronic kind of forms of communication that enable people to share globally when it's much, very difficult for them to communicate because they're not in the same place. And then also how specifically do teams work, and how, if you think about within the big units in a multinational, there are a lot of different teams. There are teams that cross borders, and what makes them, enables them to be more successful. So there's a stream of research that kind of looks at things at this level that is much more, some people are calling micro foundations. You can think about it in those terms, or meso level in the sense of drawing on disciplinary bases in sociology as well as psychology as well as some economics to inform it. So a lot of research that you can do using a combination of interviews, surveys, and also proprietary archival data sets within firms, which are hard to get access to. But I find them very fruitful when you can. And actually, my dissertation research now quite a few years ago was at the World Bank, looking not at what the World Bank is doing for externally, but how its project teams inside the organization are doing their work and what enables them to do that work more successfully. So that's the kind of level of analysis that I think there's a lot to be done at. And so, as many of us are editors and reviewers for many journals, and so sort of, if I think about the boards that I've serve on, or I'm currently an associate editor at AMJ, the kind of research that comes through. So I'm supposed to do knowledge management, international stuff, and or multinational firms, and org theory. There's a big gap still in the sort of ability to do good work that's inside the firm that really helps us to understand how these organizations can be more successful at what they're trying to do. And a lot of it's because the data's hard to get. But so when I think about kind of what are the big opportunities out here for doing this kind of research, and I think it applies to some extent for between firms research too. Let me just point to sort of three things that I think there's a lot of potential for people to be thinking about more and using more. One of them is big data, right? So this idea that there's a lot of data out there now that firms are generating as a side product of what they usually do. That is being captured, right? And a lot of that applies and is maybe useful between firms, and some of us are accessing those kinds of data. But also within firms, and particularly these large multinationals, which are just collecting data all the time on what their people are doing. So, Sandy Pendleton at MIT talks about this stuff as breadcrumbs. It's kind of the breadcrumbs that people leave behind through their interactions, right? So it's unintentional, again, byproducts of whether we communicate electronically or, we say we like things, and all this stuff just gets collected somewhere from our online interactions. But in terms of understanding how global firms are operating, this stuff has a lot of potential. It's very hard to process. It's very hard to figure out what's actually interesting in it. And people are starting to think about ways to ask interesting questions and to sort of think theoretically about these kinds of data. But I think, whether it's document downloads or the use of social media, I have a paper that's coming out shortly that's looking at kind of online discussion forums where people ask questions around the world and other people answer those questions. And, we're just looking at which questions get answered, which questions actually get attention in that kind of there's tons of stuff coming through at us all the time. So to the extent that we're interested in understanding how innovation is actually happening, how knowledge sharing is actually happening, where people get their ideas from, and who they communicate those ideas to, these sort of breadcrumb type data give us a way to do that goes beyond surveys and the ways that we've traditionally used it, and can be very powerful and enable us to show some stuff perhaps more rigorously than we've been able to do historically. Second area that I'm finding very interesting right now relates at a very different level of analysis again to many of the things that you guys have been talking about or we've been thinking about so far, which is sort of patenting or patenting, as John would say and I used to say but no longer do. Been completely corrupted, so I now say patenting. Joanne, where are you on this? Are you on the patenting or the patenting? Yeah, corrupted. We spent too long here at this point. So obviously a lot of research on patenting using large-scale data sets, right? And that's a lot of what's attractive about it. What I'm getting interested in right now is thinking about how are patents actually generated inside firms, right? So what is it that enables people to generate patents inside firms, and how does that innovation actually happening? And so again, coupling this sort of publicly available data with internal proprietary data from firms to start thinking about, well, what are the characteristics of the teams or the people that are coming up with patents, and how can firms who want to support innovation and are very setting up these big global R&D centers. So one of the projects I'm working on is looking at a Fortune 50 tech firm that you would all know who has a big Indian global R&D center. what is it that enables the people in those R&D centers to actually generate patents, which is what they're supposed to be doing, and what are the configurations of their teams that work, and are these people, able to be more effective if they work across boundaries, or does that, make it harder for them if they're working across different units, if they belong to certain communities of practice and exchange information around technologies, or even around their social interests, does that help them or not? So thinking about, again, sort of micro foundations of how the stuff is actually generated, I think we have no insight into that, essentially, at this point, so there's a lot of work to be done there. And then the last thing I would say is, thinking about who is innovating. And again, in a global context, I think it's hugely interesting and important in terms of where the ideas are coming from and who is generating them and what is the experience and the expertise of the people that are able to kind of come up with these ideas. Some of my work coming out of the World Bank stuff quite a while back has been looking at sort of cosmopolitans and locals. People have broad international experience versus people who really understand that local context very well, and the combinations of those people, the career histories of those people. I think you can think about it in lots of different ways, but the broader question is, how do people, what is it that enables people to bring novel ideas together into the table and to really generate innovations that are relevant to the local context and potentially globally influential? So that's just a few of the thoughts that I'm coming from, again, probably a more micro direction to stimulate some ideas, but different thoughts altogether from yours, hopefully.
No, actually not. No.
See.
So I was just going to say that's a nice setup. I think whenever we think of many management departments are often organized around micro foundations with individuals and groups and the dynamics that help us to explain some phenomena, in this case, understanding innovation on an international scale. But we move up from there to organizations, and I think, Heather, some of your work, that's especially some of the work, the BA work with U.S. multinationals and their subsidiary operations builds up nicely from Martine's comments about individuals and groups. So maybe you can take it from there.
Absolutely, thank you. Is this on? Yes? Okay. So thank you. I'm standing in for Eleanor Westney, so I'm sorry if you were here to see Eleanor. Projector? Yes. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have had for Eleanor in my own particular way. But so thank you for Anu for putting me on this panel. I actually think that there's a lot that Martine talked about that I'm going to talk about a little bit, and I suspect Paul will as well. So even though you're saying I'm a little bit more of an outlier, I don't think you are, right? So when we think about innovation, there's so many different levels that all come together to allow firms to have an impact on the society, different societies across different types of countries. So we're all sort of taking this from our own vantage point, but in the end, we're all thinking about the same topic, innovation and international business. So when I thought the title was Where Have We Come and Where Are We Going? So I took this as trying to think about some of the important concepts in the literature, some things that have been very influential, and then things where I think there's still opportunities. So even within those things that we think we know. And that's how I'm going to think about it. So sort of three main points that I'm going to talk about will be sort of transferring knowledge, accessing knowledge, and combining knowledge. So I'm going to start by thinking, transferring knowledge. Right? If you look at back 50 years in the IB literature, you go back to Heimer, you go back to internalization theory, you go sort of a broad swath. We've been talking about the importance of multinational firms in particular, having some kind of capability, having some kind of knowledge, technological knowledge, R&D knowledge, whatever it is, that they're exploiting in foreign countries. They've got some advantage that they're able to exploit. And really at base that involves then transferring that knowledge from the home country where it was created to foreign countries. This idea of transferring knowledge, I think, is very important. And there's several studies, and there's studies that look at different levels. There's studies that look at individuals, that look at firms, that look at countries, sort of institutions, and how difficult it can be to transfer knowledge, how difficult it can be to successfully transfer knowledge. There's a classic study at TEAS in 1977 that looked at the actual cost to transfer technology and talked about it representing between 2 and 59% of the total cost of a project. Right? So we look way back, sort of this focus on multinationals and how difficult it is to transfer knowledge because knowledge is sticky, because there's sort of different absorptive capacities, because individuals need to be receptive, right, at the individual level, and within institutions, you may not be able to protect knowledge. So I think we've thought about transferring knowledge, but I think there's so many opportunities to really try and get much better at how are firms able to successfully do this. So you talk about breadcrumbs. I think that's a fantastic way to start in terms of what other things could we look at besides patent citations, besides the fact that firms have R&D in their home country, right? How do they actually transfer that? How do we get down to that level within the firm and look at flows? Because flows are really what's important here, and I don't think we do a very good job of capturing that. So I think it's an important idea, but it's not well explored. So in some of my recent literature, I'm trying to look at other things that firms are doing that are impacting both the flows and the success of firms. So John, you talked about the global production networks. I think we also have a tendency to look at firm knowledge exclusively versus what we're doing in terms of manufacturing, who's providing inputs to other operations, and what kind of collaborative efforts are going on, not just at the knowledge level, but for these manufacturing firms that are producing something, and sort of how is that going on. So, I like the focus, the broader focus on what I think is sort of these manufacturing firms, and how can we better capture transfers. So I think first, transferring knowledge, I think if we look back, I think the more recent literature over the past 2 decades then has focused on this idea of firms trying to access knowledge, foreign knowledge seeking, access knowledge in different countries. So countries differ, and there's different knowledge stocks, and multinational firms in particular can be an advantage, getting to my third point, in terms of combining knowledge across different locations. But first, sort of backing up, just the idea of accessing foreign knowledge. So again, we tend to use patents a lot, and we look at citations, and we talk about spillovers, but there's sort of fascinating things also at the individual level. For there's this literature, Paul, that I'm sure you're going to talk about in terms of how, or maybe not, sorry, but you've done some studies where you've tried to look at like employee mobility and sort of how do we actually do that? If we think knowledge exists and it's difficult for us to even transfer our own knowledge, right, how do we successfully tap into this local knowledge that exists, and then how do we use it? How do we bring it into our firm? How do we put it into these inputs that we're going to use in other countries? So I think but the idea of accessing knowledge, that's where multi-country collaborations, these teams, I think there's some interesting literature out there that starts to get at this, but there's so many more opportunities to try and figure out, both successes and non-successes, right? What worked, but what didn't work. And I think we don't focus so much on, wow, we did this, we thought it was going to work, but it didn't pan out. Let's change, let's do something different. So I'm sort of inspired to try and look at some of that as well. All right, then combining capabilities, right? Combining knowledge from across locations. So this is assuming that we're good at transferring, and we're good at tapping into and accessing knowledge that resides in different countries. And here I think we do probably a really poor job of trying to figure out how to capture combinative capabilities, and how can we really figure out flows internal to firms. So here with the BEA data, I have access to the BEA data here. I think the flows part of this data set is actually really important. And so trying to capture, employees that are moving from one location to another through expatriates, trying to capture the flows of inputs, the sort of products going from one country to another. Also looking at patents where we've got multi-country innovators that are working together. So we know the location of the inventors. And trying to piece that together in terms of looking at what firms are doing across different locations. And the global integration and global innovation, I think, is really more where I'm at right now in my research. But I think am I good on time? I'm
doing fine.
Almost done with my time. But I think there's just a lot we don't know. And so I'll leave you with a couple of facts, right? So we talk about firms and global innovation and how important it is and how everyone's doing it. If you look at the BEA data set, it turns out that it's a much smaller percent of firms that are actually doing R&D in foreign locations. So the R&D is the last things firms add in terms of their global expansion, right? They're doing production, first they're just exporting, whatever they're doing, but it's the much more established multinational corporations that are even doing any R&D in foreign locations. And so if I look at the 89 to 09%, it's 17%, and it increases toward the end of the time period. 17% of all R&D by U.S. multinational corporations is done in a foreign location. That's not a high percent, right? 83, whatever that is, but on average, it's over 80% that's still maintained in the home country. So yes, it's important. Yes, our firms are trying to do it, but it suggests that it's really hard to do, right? Firms have a really difficult time figuring out how to tap into foreign knowledge and then how to bring it into the organization and combine it. So I think that's an important fact. And it's also reflective in the patent data. I merged in the USPTO data with the BEA. Similar types of numbers in terms of very small percents of patents that actually have any foreign inventor on them for U.S. multinational corporations. So that home country bias that many people talk about, absolutely exists with knowledge, and I think it just suggests how difficult it is to transfer, to access, to combine anywhere. I mean, in your own country it's difficult to do these things, but as soon as we introduce different institutional environments, different country settings, you're just making that even more complicated. So trying to understand how firms do that well, but also how firms haven't done that so well, I think actually provide some really interesting opportunities. All right, so I will stop there.
So it's interesting you bring up the 17%. I was thinking about the percentage of GDP in the U.S. that's related to trade, and I think it's somewhere around there as well. Where
those numbers are much lower than people talk about as well.
Much less so, but it's the world we can observe, at least with the MNC data that you have at the BEA, and I think it helps us to understand, even for that small 1/6 or fortunate sixth of firms that do it, insights about what other MNCs as well are doing it around the world. But maybe we can move from individuals and groups to within organization flows to Paul's comments, and I hope that at some point we'll talk a little about inter-firm flows and collaborations, which is part of your research as well, Paul.
I'm worried about all the expectations. You told me to talk about mobility, and you... just a point to add to Heather's, it's not just the percentage of innovation that's strikingly low of multinationals abroad. It's the type of innovation as well. Almost all of it, from little we're gauging, we just won an NSF grant, and Pietro Rivoli went out with Brad Jensen and others. It's extremely applied, and it's reluctantly applied. So it's pretty remarkable that even in this day and age,
well, and it's in developed country locations
as
well. Right?
Yeah. So that's interesting, but we should do well with our theories anyway. So firstly, thanks for being here. You know, my favorite nightmare, if you could have a favorite nightmare, is I go to the second day of class and there's no one left in class. And I was thinking when Anu said, will you come on the second day? I said, that's a strategic move, Anu. But thanks for being here. Glad you're here. I'm sure you're here to listen to Joanne, so I'm glad she keeps the crowds here. You know, when I was asked for a dissertation topic about 23 years ago, I figured out a very simple one which should have been doable in about 6 months, and this is literally what I said. I'm going to show you how knowledge flows across people, firms, and countries, and its implications for innovativeness and competitiveness. I was absolutely brilliant. And in fact, the sad part is 23 years later, I'm still saying, I will show you some part of that someday, maybe, with a lot of other people. But I have spent much of my life, I guess now, thinking about knowledge flows and everything else. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I was in Singapore because we've signed a long-term agreement with the Singapore government to help raise the human capital level. And they were introducing me to the Singapore SME bosses, who, by the way, mostly speak Chinese because they're the older people. And so I was listening to the English translation of the Chinese speech, and they called me a master of knowledge. And I thought, finally, you know, and apparently the way they phrase it, I go scattering knowledge around the world, you know, like some flower girl or something casting rose petals. And so I came back and asked my dean, I said, can I change my title from Professor of Strategy to Master of Knowledge? And, you know, he said, I'll think about it. You know, deans do that. They think about things. So for now, I'll just be the Professor of Strategy and International Business. Now, my main interest has always been in trying to understand not just the patterns of knowledge flows, but the mechanisms which facilitate knowledge flows. And not so much alliances and acquisitions, the more formal, but the less formal. And I use the word less formal because to some extent they're all formal, right? Of course, mobility, and the roles of social communities, and the act of publishing with someone from another organization, and you know, maybe the deliberate and maybe the inadvertent effects on what this means to not just the individuals, but what this means to firms and countries, but also what it means to the development of knowledge in this vast, either competitive or geographic or technological or social space. And if we actually look at how much we've advanced, and I'm coming back to this theme in a little while, in terms of connecting with each other across the world, how much easier it is. So in the last 3 weeks, I've been to Italy, Rome, Singapore, Korea. Next week I'll go to Brazil. Just compared to, say, 20 years ago, that would have been stupid for someone to do that. It's still stupid, by the way. But what does this mean, therefore, for the circulation, the building? Does it mean very little because we're so socially inclined and we're so local inherently in what's salient to us? I think we have to sort of expand the boundaries of our own thinking and sort of really, really examine both the limits of this global knowledge flow idea and building and innovation, and also perhaps think of how we're deliberately and inadvertently influencing each other and what this means for trajectories of firms. We often think we control firms and we can decide innovative directions, and I have my doubts about that because communities of scientists have their own articulation of what goes on, and very often they affect firms. So I'd like to talk about very briefly about 2 papers which will lead me to tell you some of the things I'm interested in. I'm not going to be so bold as to suggest what's important for the field or anyone else, but why I'm interested. So one paper with Francesco, sitting here and looking very humble for a change, is Beyond Markets, the Behavioral and Sociological Influences on the Likelihood of Inter-Firm Inventor Mobility. So a lot of my work and a lot of other people's work as well has been on what are the effects of inter-firm mobility, how does it affect innovativeness of the source firm or the firm you move to, etc. And we've come a long way, and it's an important, I think, informal mechanism. But obviously, who moves? Who moves has a lot to do with how useful it is and where it goes, right? And there has been some literature, in the HR literature, and I'm going to leave it aside because it's frustrating to me, but there's been a fair amount of economics literature looking at internal labor markets, external labor markets, and literature which looks at performance as being an indicator of both internal and external labor markets and who actually moves. So Francesco's idea was, what about the behavioral aspects? Can they actually explain who actually moves and doesn't move? So we tried to control, and this is 2,660 inventors in the pharmaceutical industry, and we tried to say, okay, let's control for performance, first of all. That's really, really important. Let's try to control for the standard indicators used for internal labor markets and external labor markets. And let's look at, Francesco came up with this idea of aspiration level thinking. It's not his, but to apply it in this area. And if we assume that people are influenced by their aspirations and their satisfaction with their own performance, has a lot to do with not some absolute indicator, but with what people around them are doing. So we concocted their social groups based on their patenting histories, and those would serve as basis of comparisons. And we actually used the deviation from, and that developed their aspiration level in terms of innovativeness. And we saw whether they deviated from their aspiration levels positively or negatively, and how that related to the likelihood of mobility. So we have a very interesting finding that I don't fully understand ourselves. When you're closest to the average of your social group, you're most likely to actually become mobile. This is after controlling for performance, please. And these social groups are not easily observable to the firm, right? Because they're who you work with across time, right? So it's hard to say the firm's base incentives on this or something else. And it's really, really interesting. So we've got an R&R, and the reviewers have told us, don't try to hypothesize this, just try to lay it out as a phenomenon, and then sort of test against which theories may explain this. So why I wanted to bring this up is because I think this sort of says we don't always understand what drives, for instance, mobility. We say, okay, what effect does mobility have? But obviously, right, it's conditional on someone moving. And we don't even know who moves exactly or why they move. And it goes back to some of what you were thinking. And similarly, if you're talking about social communities, why do they exactly engage in these, whether they're ethnic social communities or geographic or technological? Is it really a search for knowledge which we will then use for innovation? Is it something else? Are these byproducts? Are these the crumbs that happen to fall by? But regardless, to some extent, they're going to affect not just our innovativeness, but our innovative behavior and influence what firms and countries do in terms of innovation and how they progress. And I think too often we isolate these little things because they're manageable and doable, rather than try to understand, the broader picture of what drives innovation. The other thing Francesco and I are really interested in is decision-making biases. Well acknowledged that managers and individuals have all these decision-making biases, not just bounded rationality and local search, but a lot of others. I think there's a great opportunity to look at how these biases, and to what extent these biases transfer to the firm level, and how these biases actually affect innovative behavior or other strategic behavior as well. And I still think there's a lot of room there. There's been some research. There's a lot of room for us to explore what this really means. Now, Francesco is an honorable professor at CBS and visiting at Georgetown now. But I have another a former doctoral student, Jan Hoberger, who I still do research with. And I want to talk a little bit about his paper, The Direction of Firm Innovation, the Contrasting Roles of Strategic Alliances and Individual Scientific Collaborations. And I like this paper a lot, even though I think it got rejected by SMJ, so we sent it to research policy, and thank God they accepted it fast. And just last week. And I like this paper a lot because it tries to look at the direction of innovation and the trajectories of innovation. So there's lots of stuff on innovativeness and the causes and, incremental and, exploitation and exploration and even the speed of innovation. I find there's very little which tells us about innovative direction and trajectory and the influences on it. And so the basic idea was this, that innovative space change, especially in biotech and pharmaceuticals, continuously across the time. Where most of the innovations are taking place in scientific space actually changes. So the center of innovation for any industry is actually moving continuously across time. And as the industry is evolving, we are making decisions which will come to fruition many years later and sort of plot us in that innovation space. But we don't know exactly where the industry is moving, and we don't know exactly how or why we're moving in that direction. The idea that strategically we can determine that, I think, is a false one. And so we looked at the number of strategic alliances and the number of informal collaborations scientists in various firms had. This is in biotechnologies, firms had with other people in other industries. And we came up and we plotted where the focus of innovation in the industry was, and where the focus of firm innovation was, and whether they tended to move away from the future focus or they tended to move towards that. And firms that seem to have a greater number of scientists working with other people in the industry on papers, etc., tend to move towards the future center of innovation. And firms that tended to avoid that and rely mostly on strategic alliances tended to move and be somewhat isolated. I'm not saying one is good and the other is bad, because it depends on all sorts of competitive factors. But this is what it may mean, and I don't want to overplay this. It may mean that our choice, or incidentally, how we access knowledge, may have a lot to do with what knowledge we get and how we use it and apply it, where we innovate, and therefore where we end up in innovation space. And I love this paper. It has some limitations. I'm not going to deny it. But I think the idea is wonderful. And I think I at least want to think a little more about how I can explore this. So with the second aspect, I want to say, we live again in this very, very interconnected world. We may not be fully the masters of our universe. The idea of administrative fiat influencing direction, especially in R&D and innovation, may be a slightly false one, right? let's try to understand trajectories, and let's try to understand trajectories of innovation in firms and individuals in a very, very dynamic and interconnected world that we live in. And those are two directions I'm really sort of eager to take my research. And, to some extent, I think we're sort of admitting how the world has changed from, say, 20 years ago, and therefore how innovation studies should and can and should change. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Paul, for those comments on this. And just putting the three together, I think, is a nice complement that builds up from micro foundations, the meso, and to the macro foundations that cap it off. Let me just add a couple of comments about it. When I stepped in, Anu said, well, why don't you just not be something more than just a timekeeper, but also try and contribute the mix to it. I was so happy to hear Paul talk about behavioral theories and the like. I think we have great big questions that we've surfaced. We have increasingly the advantage of big data and sophisticated methods for it. But sometimes, and this is picking up on Martine's point, we can bring a little theory, and I sometimes think we have relatively small theories to go with those big methods and datas and the thing. And we have such a great supply of those theories that we bring from the different disciplines that contribute to management departments and the like. And then the challenge, I think, for us, and this is the end of the day, we're great at theory, right? We're idea people, is how we bring them to try and explain these phenomena, these increasingly complex phenomena about how knowledge flows and the role of firms in them. And I want to make a plug for theory. I want to make a plug for theory that also does some improbable pairings. And we do this based on our own experience. The last year for me has seen me cut down my time at the business school and half at our law school at the University of Minnesota. And so you search around for the common themes that link the lawyers and the business folk together. And other than the fact that one sues the other, right? There are some very important issues that go with it. And I think they lead, at least me, to thinking of theories where context is important and where we can find ways to build theory, add on to it, refine it so that it works in multinational, multi-context settings. Let me give you an example of what I have in mind with some research that's ongoing right now with a former doctoral student of mine who's at Atotsubashi University. And it's around a simple question in the behavioral theory of the firm, which is about, I think it's now heading into its middle age, and it's like it feels like me at about the same age. Is one of its fundamental claims is about how Slack resources are so fundamental to supporting innovation effort within firms. So, right, those resources, whether they're finance or whether they're people or plant, property, and equipment, that are in the offing, that are ready there for you to support innovation so that managers don't have to be watching over you in a micro sense with incentives. They can kind of let people go and do some of the sometimes seemingly arbitrary and capricious things that lead to some of the most important breakthroughs, even though there are the vicissitudes of performance for firms, right? They have their ups and downs. That's what Slack is there for. And it ends up, this of course is a well-studied phenomenon, largely in a US or North American sense over the past 45, 50 years. When it goes abroad, it doesn't do so well. It tells us different, sometimes contradictory things, such as this kind of Slack supports innovation in one country, say Japan, but in Korea it doesn't do it at all. In fact, it seems to deter it. And I think that kind of problem with traveling across borders begs interesting questions about context and how it differs. And this is important, I think, to any study about the nature of innovation and innovation networks, because if those networks are predicated on different rules of the business game, then the challenge for the multinational may be to try and arbitrage away those differences, but some of those arbitrage opportunities are really obstacles for it. I'm going to talk about, in our own context, how we've tried to solve this conundrum about how the Slack resource relationship doesn't always travel so well. And we've found, and at least we think is an interesting answer in and around law. Picks up on some ideas that you heard yesterday from Gernita and her path-making research with Axe and Zeke Hernandez. The ideas about how, as we move across these national settings, the rules of the game that either empower or weaken certain stakeholders in a firm, like shareholders, differ. And insofar as they strengthen shareholders, maybe shareholders are a little tougher on how much they're willing to allow managers to put aside in the offing in the way of Slack resources, particularly financial Slack resources, money, current assets. And what that might mean, therefore, is that whereas in one context where shareholders are relatively supine and managers can put that aside, then the impact of that Slack can be much greater in terms of its positive effect on innovation effort than in other places where they can be tougher. Those institutional transient shareholders who want that stuff yesterday in terms of their returns, and maybe with good reasoning for it. What it leads to is maybe less of a marginal impact of an additional unit of financial slack. At least that's what we find in our work. Here's a twist. That may be something like telling you the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, but here's a twist on it. Think of another stakeholder in the firm that aren't shareholders, and I think employees, labor, and the like. We can think across country settings where multinationals is doing operations and engaging in innovation, and the rules of the employment protection game differ across those. We're all in a business that provides us with extraordinary protection at some point in our careers so that we can engage in those sometimes arbitrary, capricious, seemingly exploratory discovery processes that then we hope lead at some point to breakthrough discoveries for it. Well, likewise in the multinational firm around the country, whether it's the lab-coated scientists that Paul was talking about, or mid-level managers in their coats and ties, or the folks on the line in the blue overalls and the like. All of them, to some extent, differ in terms of the protections that are afforded them, say, against arbitrary reductions in pay or termination, plant closings and the like. What that does in many ways is empowers them as well in terms of their say about what goes in the offing to support innovation. Now, it's not the same thing as shareholders. They don't vote up or down on management, but the kind of veto points, either absolute or suspensive, that they can exercise. You want to close your plant? You're going to have to wait just a moment on that. You have to talk to my union. And I'm looking at John right now because if you're from the UK, you know what real unions are, as opposed to, say, here in the US, especially in the last 30 years or so, or other more benign. If you want to change the nature of the way the lab is set up, there are a number of stars that are in a position to kind of talk either individually or collectively. What we find is that with regard to those employment protections, when it involves resources that are tied to people, like human capital resources, having more employment protection, just get this, actually doesn't lead to kind of them sitting around. The relationship between stronger employment protection and the positive impact of human capital resources on innovation is positive, substantial, and magnifying. That is, it suggests that maybe as we have here in academia, giving us those protections doesn't get us all to sit around and do nothing. It empowers us to go forth, to do the things that are part of our passion, to make the kind of investments in our own selves in ways that are more likely to lead to some of those breakthroughs. And I think that that's a pretty interesting and I think non-intuitive finding. Going back to my original claim, we have some great theories that sometimes suffer an application on a cross-country basis. There are ways for us to think about institutionally in context, maybe along the lines of countries that are more competitive or more corporatist, again, invoking some of Gurnita's work that I think is so important. Maybe by going even a little bit deeper to some of the underlying mechanisms that lead to more cooperation or competition in law, in politics, in education, in culture, and the like. But I think one of the challenges for us going forward is how we can take this great supply of theories that are wonderful, at least developed in their domestic sense, often in the North American sense, because that's where the business schools were, where a lot of those were developed, and how we can then internationalize them. And it doesn't have to be just the behavioral theory. Think of all the retinue of theories that are part of organization theory, that are part of strategic management, that are part of OB and the like, and social psychology. How we can marshal those to look anew at some of the basic questions that we've been confronting since yesterday and now into this late morning, early afternoon, about how multinationals fuel innovation, about how they disperse and concentrate at times those networks for innovation, about how we engage in problem solving, and how whatever the leveling effects of multinationals are, they're leveling big mountains that aren't going away anytime soon in the way of differences in law and culture and politics. That's not something to be lamented. That's something to be celebrated as a matter of our research, I think. It's also something to be celebrated maybe from a policy standpoint. Because if we can have a variety of capitalisms that are around innovation, then we have a variety of experiments about what works best, when, and how, rather than one size fits all. We had a previous panel here talking about their lack of love for the Washington Consensus. Well, count me in on that, right? That's a one size fits all set of policies for it. I think instead we need a kind of variety of those policies around innovation management and the multinational. And this is a great group to talk about that variety. I hope we'll continue to do that in our discussions today and our research tomorrow. With that, let me turn it over to all of you for some questions. John, and we'll wait for the microphone to come to you so you can pose them.
Thank you. I have some suggestions, one suggestion each for Martine and for Paul. Martine, you were talking about what are the micro foundations, what are the characteristics of individual inventors or their teams that particularly lead to patenting and, innovative behavior. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with, I'd draw your attention, if you're not, to the work of Ivo Zander in Uppsala and some of his colleagues, Katarina Blomqvist and Philip Kapin. They had a paper in GIBS, among others. They've recently had one in Research Policy. And they look at superstar subsidiaries, as they call them. These are subsidiaries that have very large numbers of patents by the standards of their corporate group. So they find a big skewness in terms of the distribution of patenting within firms. But then even when you bring it down to the individual level, they find a big skewness across individual inventors. There are certain individuals whose names always crop up in the patent records of certain firms. So what this suggests is that essentially there's a kind of connection between the individual and the team, and the individual star is extremely important to the team as a whole. So for instance, in one illustration that they give of a Swedish firm that was operating historically in the United States, the US subsidiary was the superstar. Within that, there was one inventor who was named on every single patent. When that guy retired, then things basically shut down. They were no longer a superstar. The number of patents declined very rapidly. And essentially that subunit was wound up within a decade later. So this really suggests that individuals play some kind of key role that we don't yet entirely understand. And therefore, I think if you could push a bit more on that, that would be extremely interesting to know more about the role of individuals within teams and consequently the overall consequences for the firm as a whole. And for Paul, I have a suggestion somewhat connected actually to what Ganita was also saying yesterday, which is you're finding that it's when you're closest to the average of your social group, if I understood you correctly, that you then are more likely to become mobile. Well, this might be, Ganita was talking about the particularly important role of brokers in networks. It might be that in this point you become more likely to be a boundary spanner, a connector, because being in the average kind of position, you can relate to both people above you and below, and therefore you become a kind of connector. Now, if this is right, then you become kind of valuable for other organisations, or indeed within your own organisation for other units. So there may be more opportunities perhaps to move in a situation in which you become a kind of, representative agent of connectivity. Now, whether this is true or not, I don't know, but it's a kind of speculation that maybe...
Wouldn't it, to my mind, that would more likely work the other way? I'm just thinking aloud, John. Because that kind of connectivity and that kind of sort of relationship developing would be most observable internally rather than externally. And therefore, it would increase the chance of you staying rather than you leaving. Also, you have more social capital developed internally. You're more likely that the cost to you of leaving is greater. But the results are the other way around.
Well, it depends on the nature of teams, I think, Paul, because if the project-based teams do already span organisational boundaries, this may act as a signal to other organisations about your potential relevance. So, this goes back to now Heather's point about global production networks involve inter-organisational associations. So it may be that there's a kind of connectivity there that comes to light more widely than just within the firm itself. So you kind of have stronger and denser connections, not just within the firm, but outside it as well.
No, we control for that separately.
Oh, okay.
Outside, yeah.
Well, that was just a suggestion, but it's not just the number of ties, if that's what you're controlling for. It's also the dispersion of those ties, the dispersion of knowledge or ideas. So being in the middle of the population you connect across a wider dispersion of actors. So it may be just not the number of ties, but the sort of the non-redundant types of knowledge that you're linking together.
We could definitely explore that more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just an idea.
Yeah.
Other questions? I was just wondering, Martine, I was picking up on John's point about the role of individuals or stars and teams, and in terms of the research as you see this, I mean, who's touching on those issues? Like, kind of, who are the outliers and their contributions to innovation within, say, the multinational firm?
I mean, there's certainly research on that. I mean, Boris Groysberg's work is looking at individuals and how they, when people move, they're much more effective if they move as a team than if they move as individuals. But that's looking at investment banks. It's very decontextualized from the international point of view. So actually, what I was thinking about as you were saying that was exactly coming back to your previous point, which is, it's. I wonder whether across countries there is variation in the extent to which those individual superstars matter, right? And if you set up a sort of set of institutional arrangements within the firm that are going to facilitate not reliance on one individual, you may see variation in that across countries, right? So some countries may be better able to, set up more connected teams where it's not just driven by, the superstar in the US kind of thing. So I think from an international point of view, it would be very interesting to think about that variation.
Well, and just to add on, so I see that with the U.S. MNCs, it's the U.S. inventors who are on some of these foreign invented patents, and you do see the repetition of certain individuals. I mean, it's definitely an interesting idea of the star, how the firm is using that star, and how the star is connecting with people in the home country and people in foreign countries, and maybe that's a really important way that we're seeing transfer and both ways, transfer this way and sort of coming back home.
Since we have such great experts in innovation here today, I had a question on the relationship between government regulation, government incentives, and innovation. Starting to get interested in that myself in the context of climate change and energy. So I was just wondering what your view is and what the body of knowledge out there is, how government regulation and incentives can foster innovation, or if they could impede it, even what the verdict is out there. Thank you.
Do you mind if I just address it? By chance, I have a colleague, again, I'm running into these new colleagues at the law school. One of them is very interested in green tech and the kind of legal reforms that would encourage green tech across countries. And she's an American, but is very interested in what's happening in, say, Australia and New Zealand, where you got a lot of sun, and therefore we have a lot of interest in those issues. And one of the things, actually, this research I was just discussing now that seeks to document what we generally know, which is that more in the way of slack resources, especially human capital slack resources, people, tends to lead to more innovation effort in firms. But the thing that goes with it is there's this tremendous positive magnifying effect on that, where you find stronger protections for the employees that are in those offing, that human capital. And we've looked at that issue with regard to broad innovation effort differences within firms across countries, and now we're doing it with green tech, where the outcome of interest is in the number of announced new green tech projects in a given country. So it's a specialized area. I don't claim expertise in the green tech aspect of it, right? I wouldn't know green from brown to whatever in terms of the tech for it. But take that as given. It's an interesting micro opportunity to confirm what we think we see in the broader. And consistent with what we talk about, there's this positive impact. That is, if I protect employees more, and this, at least with regard to the human capital inputs that go into that innovation effort for green tech, it results in a higher count of new tech projects for the average firm in these countries across the 1990s and early 2000s.
So I think you can also there's a lot of research that looks at differences in IP protection, and there's some great indices out there. Walter Park at American here in DC has an index that a lot of people use. I think it's, firms are certainly locating their knowledge activities on those countries that have higher protections for intellectual property, right? So if you look at where firms are actually locating their R&D, it's by and large in developed country locations where they're able to, feel like it's better protected. So I think there's certainly that out there, and there's indices that can help you look across countries to get at some of that. For your specific setting, I hope there'd be better sources for looking at particular industries, but at a broad view, I'm just trying to do that.
Question.
For Martine and Heather in particular. in terms of your statistic that you said, right, 17% of all R&D is actually, in terms of U.S. MNCs, is produced outside of the U.S.
Yes.
I was actually not surprised by it. I feel it's almost high. In particular, if you think about comparative advantages across different countries, U.S. has a very clear comparative advantage in producing R&D or innovation. So why would they actually outsource this?
Yeah.
So in that sense, and this goes to my second question, and you just explained also, IP protection is a large drawer for innovation. And again, in developed countries, there's a tendency for better institutions, better protection. So my question is, as researchers, if we want to measure innovation, is R&D expenditure, number of patents, are those really the great measures of innovation? Because those would bias us in looking particularly into developed countries, not into developing or emerging markets. For instance, my travels to Africa, I would see people using washing machines in South Sudan that require very little electricity and be prone to power outages. That's an innovation, right? But yet those would not be counted under patent citation or R&D development because it's a small step. So in that regard, how can we as researchers account for these type of emerging market or developing country, low-income countries types of innovation and not be drawn directly towards R&D expenditure, et cetera?
No, that's very fair. I think we would all agree that the R&D measures, the patent measures, are not ideal, and we're not capturing a lot of interesting things that are going on. I mean, I actually think so. The World Bank surveys that you use in terms of asking about different types of innovation are very fascinating in that respect. But even you got the question: are all these things really innovation? Like, how do I think about just partnering with someone? Is that an innovation? And so this is the contextual issue of it. We don't do a great job in terms of coming up with measures that actually have meaning across different country settings. I think the R&D and the patents are a conservative measure that tend to be used a lot. That's not to suggest that they're the only ones that we should be using. We do. The patent citations, trying to look at knowledge flows, that's also not the best way to think about, who did you really talk to? Who did you build on? And then that whole issue of patent examiners adding the citation, it ends up being very messy. So I think your question is actually really important.
But going back to your original point, why not all in developed countries, depending on what you look as the motivation for moving R&D abroad. And if it could be to learn, and to absorb local signals that you wouldn't otherwise get, and if you're interested in emerging markets, and if your product is more consumer-oriented or whatever, there could be other reasons, but we know that intellectual property is a big one. We know that human capital is the other big one. Yeah. But it doesn't mean that there isn't other stuff going on, especially very, like you said, applied R&D kind of stuff. I think there's a lot going on, but as Heather said, the best imperfect measure, and the most convenient, maybe, imperfect measure to get things published as opposed to discover new knowledge, maybe patents. And that is something we have to deal with.
No, but I do think that there are a lot of options here, and you should be. It's great to think about it more creatively. I've never used R&D stuff, mostly because I'm looking within firms. I'm just starting to look at the patents, but I've avoided it. And again, because I think it's interesting to think about how they're generated at a ground level. One of the reasons I've avoided it is because it's so many people are using them, and they have the benefit of generalizability, right? And accessibility as a data source. But if you think about what firms are actually doing in terms of innovation, a lot of what I try to do is use firms' own measures of things that they care about, whether it's project quality or team performance or innovation, right? So some of my work looks at, firms have their own measures. A lot of them are really bad. A lot of the data are really bad. But firms will often try to say, are these projects highly innovative? Are they innovative in these ways? Are they new to the firm? Are they new to the world? And that kind of research, if you can get hold of those kinds of internal measures, start to tell us something different about where innovation is coming from and what different forms of innovation might be. So I do think there's some potential to do that, but you trade off the generalizability across firms with the more fine-grained ways of understanding how different kinds of innovations are generated. And certainly when you go to that level, there's no question that a ton of innovation is happening outside the US, but it's a very different kind of innovation. And doesn't mean it's any less valuable. I think, again, huge gaps in our understanding of what that is. So I would totally say go for it if you can find any of that.
Really, in terms of actually informing the field,
Yeah.
some of those studies, I think we learn much more than yet another study, that I might do. Seriously.
Or any of us might do. So, and the 17%, it's an interesting thing. What does that mean? Is that high? Is that low? I think if you look at a lot of studies that talk about the global innovation and how everyone's doing it and it's everywhere, that number would suggest, well, hold on, there's challenges here, and we need to think about how to do it at a minimum.
And how little it's changed over time was what's more startling to me.
Yeah.
That it really hasn't changed that much as the stories have.
I wonder if I could ask my panelists, we're coming near the end of this, but if I could pose my kind of moderator prerogative on this, is if you could give us some commentary about where they think the research is going, and hopefully I'm not complicating too much by saying not so much about innovation, fueling international business and innovation, but international business and breakthrough innovation. For a moment, not all innovations are created equal on that. I think, was I'm thinking back to some of the work by Baumel about how multinationals, established firms are wonderful for incremental changes in products, processes, and the like. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm all for whatever that happens in the way of what it does to enrich firms and to render societies more productive and wealthy in other ways. But I think we have in mind, we've discussed more than once the notion of outliers and stars and radical innovations. And I wonder if maybe you could give us a little sense about how in your research at the individual, organizational, network level, what is part of that recipe, at least in terms of the research and where we're going on that, to study how breakthrough innovations occur, the kind of things that kind of Schumpeterian, that bring down whole industries, or at least bring down segments of them as they rise up with others.
Okay, so I'll start with that. If you want to jump in. So I actually have a paper with Juan Alcácer that we're working on, looking at radical and incremental innovation in foreign countries. So I swear I did not tell him that beforehand. In fact, we'll see if we even get to the point where we can feel it's a good draft to share with people. But it's, I think there we're looking at, again, these internal connections that firms have, trying to think about the connections with the local environment, but also thinking about the internal transfers that are happening across the global production network of the multinational corporations. And we're finding that those firms that are heavily reliant on the parent firm knowledge, which is a lot of what we see transferring to foreign locations, they're doing the incremental stuff, which makes some sense. They're taking what the parent firm does and they're exploiting it in that foreign market, right? They've got knowledge that they can just tweak a bit, and they're coming up with some things that are adapting it. But those firms that are really investing in manufacturing specialization is what we're calling it, where you are producing products and inputs for other operations of the multinational in third countries and the home country, those are the ones that are producing more of the radical innovation. So those ones that have specialization, those ones that have more responsibility, if you will, those centers, people, charters, those ones that maybe are told you can do more, we'll give you a little more flexibility here, right? Those are the ones that are producing the more radical innovation. And it's in tends to be in these more developed country locations, again, where like the IP protection I think matters, which is where we're seeing the patents happen. So the stuff that's happening in developing countries, we're just not able to get as much. I think it'd be fascinating there because that's where you could see some really divergent ideas for, well, you do it this way in your country, but in this country, this is much more efficient and this is going to have a much bigger impact on so many more people. So we can't get at some of that through the patent data.
Martine, Paul?
Start with that.
I mean, I don't have a highly evolved way of thinking about it, but I think it kind of connects to Paul's stuff. To me, the interesting question is where these people and ideas are coming from. Now, it may get patented in the US, but I mean, I'm very interested in, to what extent are these ideas actually being generated in other parts of the world. So the US people are spending time in those countries, or they're transferring their people across borders, whether it's temporarily or longer term. And I think those patterns have got to be hugely shifting, and the ideas increasingly have got to be coming from parts of the world that are not the US. I mean, obviously there's huge innovations coming from Silicon Valley and everything else, but I think there's an enormous amount of really impactful bottom of the pyramid type innovation that, regardless of where it's being patented, is coming from somewhere else. And that, figuring out ways to capture that or research that, I think is going to be very valuable.
I totally agree. Firstly, I think we need to be more cautious about radical and breakthrough, etc. Radical for who? And, is it radical for me, but not for the industry, given how much the industry has changed so far, etc. And I always cringe when I read many of these words because I'm not quite sure what the author means or what anyone really means. by some of them. I'm not saying there aren't differences and there isn't some continuum depending on who you're talking about, or if you're talking about the industry level or your level. But going back to Martine's point, I think a lot of the influences for different types of innovations, and so I'm going to stay away from radical, breakthrough, etc., are more diffused now, and trying to understand what they are and whether it will allow a firm to take a large jump in competitive space because of some change in innovation or technology or not. So we can, whether the innovation itself is radical or breakthrough, it may allow firms to do amazing things. So how would we look at, say, Google, or would we look at Facebook as a product of radical or breakthrough or something else? And those, let's face it, those firms and that part of the industry have changed our lives in dramatic ways and had huge spillover effects to all sorts of things, including innovation within firms. And so, again, I don't know whether we should focus on radical versus breakthrough, or really try to understand the broader space and the broader connections, which will give us, I think, both a new nomenclature and a new way of thinking about innovation.
We have time for one more question, if we could.
I want to make a comment because I have been working on this radical idea and measuring things and this idea of how they diffuse things. And I work with patents, so I want to break an arrow here for the patents. And I just introduced a measure in a research policy paper 2 months ago that measures the influence of a patent, how a patent changes the evolution of the technology, right? And it's capturing not only the direct effect, but the indirect effect. So now you have a measure that is measuring all the patents. I have that measure developed for all the patents in the USPTO. I'm going to do the same thing for the European patent base. And it lets you see which are the patents with the most influence, who have more effect on the evolution of the technology, right? I compare that with looking at the direct count of citations. That is what we use to measure radical innovation. And there are huge differences. In the semiconductor industry, patents over 10 years, the top 120 patents in influence, only 30 are top 100% in impact. Right?
25%.
So this diffuse thing that happens over time that we don't see directly, it's huge. So the problem I have and why I got into patents is because in patents I have a system when I can look at this, right? And these are inventions, not innovations. So all the challenges of innovations and how these affect what and what is the context, that is clean with the patents, right? But it gives us the opportunity to look at these systems of how things affect the evolution of others in the future and how these indirect effects happen. So this is the variable that I developed for patent influence. And I want to make sure if you are going to pick that thing, please don't talk about patent innovation. It's not innovation, it's invention, right? Make that distinction. But that will help to understand how the system works. And if we really understand how that works, we may find the parallels and help us to look at the context of different businesses or situations to understand how that radical thing works. It's the best proxy that I could figure out to measure this radical thing.
It's, I think, one of the hardest things in international business is to deal with language. And so obviously we cross borders and it involves different languages. And but I think in a disciplinary sense, to have a meaningful discussion that doesn't turn into babble, as in the tower, around issues of international business investment and innovation policy. And I think that's been accomplished to some large extent with the three of you up here. And I appreciate so much your comments about where we're going and how we got there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.